The dining room fell silent when Thomas Whitfield walked through the front door. "That's you. At our family Thanksgiving. Uninvited. Still with that tiny internet thing?" Dad had been teasing just moments before, carving the turkey with theatrical flourish. Mom had sighed beside him. "When will you join a real company?" My sister Brooke had smirked across the table. I'd stayed quiet, checking my watch. Now Thomas Whitfield stood in the foyer, briefcase in hand, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. "Chairwoman Foster," he said, straightening his tie. "The $2.8 billion acquisition is complete. The board needs your signature." Dad's carving knife clattered against the serving platter. His face went pale. I was the placeholder child. Not the first. That honor belonged to Brooke, born in 1988 to great fanfare and even greater expectations. Not the last. That would have been the son my parents tried for but never had. I was the middle attempt, the 1991 arrival who turned out to be another girl, the child who existed in the space between the golden firstborn and the hoped-for heir. My father, Richard Foster, had built Titan Logistics from the ground up. Started with a single warehouse in 1982, grew it into a regional shipping empire by the time I was born, and transformed it into a national powerhouse worth $340 million by the time I turned 18. Titan Logistics moved goods across America. Warehouses, trucking fleets, distribution networks. Dad called it the backbone of commerce. Brooke was groomed to inherit that backbone. I was groomed to stay out of the way. My first memory of understanding my place in the family hierarchy happened when I was 7 years old. Dad had taken Brooke, then 11, to visit the company's newest distribution center, a $12 million facility in Indianapolis that represented Titan's expansion into the Midwest. I'd asked to come. Begged, actually, the way 7-year-olds do, with tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. "It's not really your thing, Tegan," Dad had said, ruffling my hair. "You'd be bored. Besides, this is serious business stuff. Brooke needs to learn how the company works." "I want to learn too. Maybe when you're older." I wasn't invited when I was older. I was never invited at all. Instead, I spent that Saturday with Mom, who took me to a craft fair and bought me a journal. "For your stories," she said. "You're the creative one, Tegan. That's your gift." I wrote stories. Brooke learned logistics. The paths were set before I turned 8. The second memory crystallized when I was 12. By then, I discovered the internet, specifically the emerging world of e-commerce. It was 2003, and while most kids my age were playing video games, I was fascinated by how businesses operated online. I'd started a small venture selling handmade bookmarks through a rudimentary website I'd built myself. I made $347 that year. For a 12-year-old, it felt like a fortune. I showed Dad my spreadsheet, actual revenue tracking, customer data, profit margins. I'd taught myself basic accounting from library books. He'd glanced at the numbers, then back at the financial report he'd been reviewing. Titan Logistics had just crossed $50 million in annual revenue. "That's cute, Tegan. Real entrepreneurial." He returned to his work. "But you know, Brooke just completed her first internship at the warehouse. She's really understanding the supply chain now." Brooke was 16. Her internship had involved shadowing an operations manager for 2 weeks during summer break. My $347 business disappeared into the noise of my family's expectations. The third defining memory happened when I was 19. I'd been accepted to Stanford, not for business, which Dad had suggested, but for computer science. I'd discovered that my real passion wasn't just selling things online. It was building the systems that made online commerce possible. The scholarship covered 80% of tuition. I needed help with the remaining $23,000 per year. "Stanford's a fine school," Dad said when I presented my case. "But computer science, that's not going to help you in the real world, Tegan. Brooke's getting her MBA at Wharton. That's practical. That's useful. Computer science is useful. The internet is going to. The internet's a tool, sweetheart. Not a career." He'd written a check anyway, but not for Stanford. For the state school 40 minutes from home, where I could stay close to family and figure things out. I went to Stanford. I took out loans. I worked 3 jobs. And I never asked my parents for money again. By 22, I'd graduated with dual degrees in computer science and economics, $94,000 in debt, and a startup idea that my professors called ambitious, and my family called another little internet thing. That startup, A logistics optimization platform I'd developed based on everything I'd observed growing up in the shadow of Titan Logistics was called Velocity Systems. Within 5 years, it was worth $180 million. Within 8 years, $890 million. By the time I turned 32, Velocity Systems had merged with 3 other tech companies to form Apex Logistics Technology, a holding company I controlled through 67% ownership. Combined valuation, $2.3 billion. And nobody in my family knew. To them, I was still Tegan with her tiny internet thing. Still the creative one. Still the placeholder child who'd never quite found her footing in the real world of commerce. They had no idea that the real world of commerce had shifted beneath their feet, and I was the one who'd engineered the earthquake. Thanksgiving at the Foster family estate was, as always, a production. The house itself announced old money, or at least the appearance of it. A 7-bedroom colonial in Connecticut, purchased when Titan Logistics first turned profitable, maintained with the kind of aggressive perfection that suggested Mom had hired a staging company rather than a cleaning service. I'd arrived that morning, driving the same Honda Civic I'd owned for 6 years. The car was deliberate, nothing flashy, nothing that would invite questions. My actual garage in San Francisco contained a Tesla and a vintage Porsche, but Connecticut didn't need to know that. The family had gathered by noon. Brooke arrived with her husband Mitchell, a junior partner at a consulting firm who never missed an opportunity to mention his Harvard MBA. Their 2 children, both under 5, had been handed off to a nanny in the upstairs playroom. Mom supervised the caterers. Dad held court in the living room, scotch in hand, regaling Uncle Richard with tales of Titan Logistics' latest expansion. "We're looking at a major acquisition," Dad was saying when I walked in. $2.8 billion valuation. If we can secure the financing, Titan becomes the 3rd largest logistics company in the eastern United States. I set my overnight bag by the door and listened. "The board's been cautious," Dad continued. "But Thomas Whitfield, my CEO, he's been pushing for it. Says we can't afford not to grow." I knew all about the acquisition. I knew about it because I'd been orchestrating it for the past 14 months. What Dad didn't know, what nobody at Titan Logistics knew, was that the company acquiring them wasn't a competitor. It was me. Apex Logistics Technology, through a subsidiary called Northern Star Holdings, had been quietly purchasing Titan stock for over a year. Combined with the institutional investors I'd personally recruited, I now controlled 71% of Titan Logistics voting shares. The acquisition Dad was celebrating? He was the target. "Tegan." Mom spotted me from the kitchen doorway. "You made it. How was the drive?" "Fine, Mom." "Still driving that old Honda?" "Brooke and Mitchell just got a new Range Rover. Mitchell says it's the safest car for the children." Mitchell across the room nodded smugly. "The Honda runs fine." Dinner proceeded through its predictable arc. Turkey was carved. Wine was poured. Conversation centered on Brooke's latest promotion, Senior VP of Operations at Titan, reporting directly to Dad, Mitchell's clever investment strategies, and the grandchildren's preschool achievements. Nobody asked about my work. They already knew, that tiny internet thing. Not worth discussing. Then came the question. "So Tegan," Dad said, setting down his wine glass, "still with that online business?" "Still there." "What is it again?" "Something with shipping. Logistics software." He chuckled. "Logistics software. You know, if you wanted to actually understand logistics, you could have just asked me. 40 years of experience right here. I'll keep that in mind. When will you join a real company?" Mom added, sighing. "You're 32, honey. At your age, Brooke was already a vice president." "At a company Dad handed her," I said mildly. The table went quiet. "Excuse me." Brooke's voice sharpened. "Nothing. Just an observation." Dad cleared his throat. "Now let's not." The doorbell rang. Everyone looked toward the foyer. We weren't expecting anyone. Mom stood. "I'll get it." She returned 30 seconds later, her face arranged in the particular expression of polite confusion she reserved for unexpected visitors. Behind her stood Thomas Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield was 63 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed even on a holiday. He'd been CEO of Titan Logistics for 8 years. Dad's hand-picked successor, the man trusted to run the company while Dad transitioned to chairman. What Dad didn't know was that Thomas and I had been in communication for 14 months. It had started with due diligence. When Apex Logistics Technology began acquiring Titan stock, I'd needed inside information. Not illegal insider trading, but the kind of operational intelligence that comes from actually understanding a company. Thomas, to his credit, had figured out who was buying before anyone else. He'd reached out through intermediaries. We'd met in person twice in San Francisco. He'd asked questions. I'd answered them. By the end of our second meeting, Thomas Whitfield understood exactly what was happening and had made his choice. He would stay on as CEO under new ownership. In exchange, he'd help ensure the transition went smoothly. The acquisition had closed that morning. Thanksgiving Day. The timing wasn't accidental. Thomas. Dad rose from his chair, surprise and concern warring on his face. What are you doing here? Is something wrong with the deal? Thomas stepped into the dining room, briefcase in hand. His eyes swept across the family. Mom, Brooke, Mitchell, Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, the various cousins who'd gathered for the holiday, before settling on me. Good evening, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your celebration. He straightened his tie. Chairwoman Foster, the $2.8 billion acquisition is complete. The board needs your signature on the final transfer documents. The silence that followed was absolute. Dad's carving knife, still in his hand from earlier, slipped and clattered against the serving platter. Turkey juice splattered across the white tablecloth. Chairwoman Foster. Mom's voice came out as a whisper. Thomas set his briefcase on the sideboard and produced a leather portfolio. Ms. Foster, Tegan Foster, is the majority shareholder of Apex Logistics Technology, which as of 3 p.m. today owns 71% of Titan Logistics voting shares. She's also the chairwoman of Apex's board, which means she's now the effective owner of this company. Brooke's wine glass tumbled from her fingers. Red liquid spread across the tablecloth like a blood stain. That's impossible, Dad said, but his voice had gone hollow. The acquirer was Northern Star Holdings, some private equity firm out of Delaware. Northern Star Holdings is a subsidiary of Apex Logistics Technology, Thomas said. The corporate structure was designed to maintain confidentiality during the acquisition process. Quite common in deals of this magnitude. But Tegan runs some kind of internet startup. Dad turned to me, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching fear. You sell software. You told me you sell software. I do sell software, Dad. Logistics optimization software. The same software that Titan Logistics licensed 3 years ago to improve your shipping efficiency. Another silence. Wait, Brooke said slowly. Velocity Systems. That's your company. That's one of my companies. But Velocity Systems is worth $890 million at last valuation. But Apex Logistics Technology, the holding company I formed from Velocity and 3 other acquisitions, is worth $2.3 billion. Kept my voice level. And as of this afternoon it's worth $2.3 billion plus whatever Titan Logistics is worth. Minus the premium I paid, of course. Thomas Whitfield produced a tablet from his briefcase. For context, the board voted unanimously to approve the acquisition. The institutional shareholders were enthusiastic. Apex's track record with logistics optimization is exceptional. Employee retention packages have been guaranteed for all current staff. All current staff, Brooke repeated. What about executive leadership? That's subject to review by the new chairwoman. Thomas glanced at me. Ms. Foster has indicated that all personnel decisions will be made on merit. Dad sank into his chair. The color had drained from his face entirely. You bought my company. You actually bought my company. Technically, I bought the shareholders' company. You own 12% of Titan Logistics, Dad. The other 88% belongs to investors who were happy to sell at a 34% premium. But I'm the chairman. You are the chairman. As of 3 p.m. today, the board has been restructured. You've been offered a position as chairman emeritus, an advisory role with a $600,000 annual compensation package and an office in whatever location you prefer. Uncle Richard's fork clattered against his plate. $600,000 for an advisory role? It's a generous package, Thomas confirmed. More than generous, given the circumstances. The dining room had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where moments ago there had been a family Thanksgiving, turkey and traditions, the familiar hierarchies of parent and child, successful and struggling, now there were documents spread across the tablecloth, lawyers on speakerphone, and a power structure that had inverted completely. I hadn't moved from my seat. Hadn't raised my voice. Hadn't done anything except answer questions as they came. "Miss Foster," Thomas said, handing me a pen, "we need your signature on 3 documents. The asset transfer, the board restructuring, and the employment continuity guarantees." I signed while my family watched. "How long?" Mom's voice was barely audible. "How long have you been, building the company?" 12 years. "Planning this specific acquisition?" 14 months. I set down the pen. I started Velocity Systems in my Stanford dorm room with $2,400 in savings and a maxed-out credit card. By the time I turned 25, we had $12 million in revenue. By 30, $180 million in valuation. "We never knew," Dad said almost to himself. "You never said anything." I said plenty. "You weren't listening." Thomas produced another document. "There's one more matter to address. The board has requested a formal review of executive compensation at Titan Logistics. Some irregularities were identified during due diligence." Brooks' head snapped up. "What kind of irregularities?" "Primarily in the Senior VP of Operations Division. Expense reports that don't align with company policy. Consulting fees paid to firms owned by relatives of executives. That sort of thing." Mitchell went very still. "My team will conduct the review over the next 30 days, I said. "Anyone found in violation of company policy will be subject to appropriate consequences. Up to and including termination." "You're going to fire your own sister?" Brooks' voice cracked. "I'm going to conduct a fair review. If you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about." Brooke and Mitchell exchanged glances. Whatever passed between them wasn't confidence. The doorbell rang again. This time Thomas answered it himself. He returned with 2 people I recognized. Angela Martinez, my chief legal counsel, and David Kim, my head of operations. Both had flown in from San Francisco specifically for this moment. "Chairwoman Foster," Angela said, handing me a leather portfolio. "The SEC filing is complete. The acquisition will be announced to the markets at 9 a.m. Monday. Press inquiries are already coming in. Apparently someone leaked." "Who leaked?" "We're not sure yet. But Bloomberg has the story. They're running with tech billionaire acquires father's company in surprise Thanksgiving takeover." Dad made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Something between a gasp and a groan. "Tech billionaire," Aunt Patricia repeated. "Tegan is a billionaire?" "Forbes estimated her net worth at $1.4 billion last year," David said. "The Titan acquisition will likely push that closer to $2 billion, depending on market response." Cousin Derek dropped his phone. It bounced off the table and landed screen first on the hardwood floor. "The Thanksgiving takeover," Mom said faintly. "They're calling it the Thanksgiving takeover. Media loves a narrative." I stood, gathering the signed documents. "Angela, please ensure the employee communications go out first thing Monday. I want our people, Titan's people, to hear from us before they hear from the press." "Already drafted. David approved the messaging this morning." "Good." I turned to Thomas. "You'll stay on as CEO as we discussed. But I want weekly reports for the first quarter. No surprises." "Understood, Chairwoman." My father hadn't moved. He sat in his chair at the head of the table, the patriarch's position he'd occupied for every family gathering I could remember, looking at me like he'd never seen me before. Because he hadn't. Not really. Immediate consequences. The evening continued in a strange, suspended state. Angela and David had set up a temporary command center in Dad's study. Ironic, given the circumstances. Calls came in every few minutes. Board members seeking reassurance, institutional investors requesting meetings, journalists hoping for quotes. I handled each one with the same calm I'd maintained all night. This was, after all, just another acquisition. Bigger than most. More personal than any. But still just business. The family had scattered throughout the house, processing in their own ways. Mom had retreated to the kitchen, where I could hear her stress washing dishes that were already clean. Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia made hurried excuses and left, taking their children with them. Mitchell had disappeared into the backyard, phone pressed to his ear, presumably calling his own lawyers. Brooke found me in the study. The consulting fees, she said without preamble. Mitchell's brother's firm. I knew about it. I looked up from my laptop. I assumed you did. It wasn't that much. A few $100,000 over 3 years. $847,000 according to our forensic accountants. For consulting services that were never actually provided. Brooke's face went gray. You know about that? I know about everything, Brooke. I've had 14 months to review every line item in Titan's financials. The consulting fees. The expense reports from your Costa Rica site visits. The company credit card charges at Neiman Marcus that were coded as office supplies. She swayed slightly. Sit down before you fall down. She sat. I'm not going to pursue criminal charges, I said. The amounts aren't worth the publicity, and honestly I don't want to see my sister in prison. But I am going to require full restitution. $847,000 from you and Mitchell, returned to the company within 60 days. We don't have. You have a house worth $2.3 million and a portfolio of investments Mitchell likes to brag about at every family dinner. You have the money. Or you can find it. Brooke stared at me. You've really thought this through. I've thought everything through, Brooke. That's what I do. It's what I've always done. You just never noticed because you were too busy being the golden child. She flinched. Escalating consequences. Over the next 3 weeks, the consequences cascaded. The forensic review uncovered more than just Brooke's consulting fee scheme. Dad, it turned out, had been using company resources for personal expenses for years. A beach house in the Hamptons technically owned by a Titan subsidiary, a private jet that showed up on the books as executive transportation, but flew exclusively to his golf destinations. Mitchell's brother's firm wasn't the only shell company receiving payments for services never rendered. The total irregularities exceeded $4.2 million. I presented the findings at a board meeting 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. Dad sat across the table from me, the same man who'd told me computers were not really my thing, who'd funded Brooks Wharton MBA while making me take out loans for Stanford, who'd spent 30 years building a company while telling me I wasn't suited for business. These are serious governance failures, I said, laying out the documentation. The board will need to decide on appropriate remediation. Dad cleared his throat. As chairman emeritus, I'd like to suggest that we consider the historical context. You're not chairman emeritus yet, Dad. That appointment is pending the board's review of these findings. Kept my voice level. The advisory role I offered was contingent on clean financials. These aren't clean. The board voted to reduce Dad's compensation package by 40% and require repayment of $1.8 million in improperly allocated expenses. The beach house would be sold. The jet would be grounded. Brooke's position was eliminated entirely, restructured, in corporate speak. She was offered a severance package and 6 months of career counseling services. Mitchell was referred to the State Bar Association for ethics review. His law firm, when they learned about the investigation, asked for his resignation. Final consequences. By Christmas, the Foster family had transformed entirely. Dad spent his days in the Hamptons beach house, the one he'd been forced to purchase from Titan at fair market value, avoiding calls and declining invitations. Mom had filed for legal separation, citing irreconcilable differences and financial betrayal. The forensic review had revealed several expenses Dad had hidden from her as well. Brooke and Mitchell were selling their Connecticut mansion to cover the restitution payments. Their marriage, strained by the sudden reversal of fortune, showed cracks at every family gathering. Me. I was running 2 companies now, Apex Logistics Technology and the reformed Titan Logistics. The integration was proceeding ahead of schedule. Employee satisfaction scores were up 23%. Stock price had increased 41% since the acquisition announcement. The media called it the most surprising corporate story of the year. Harvard Business Review was writing a case study. Forbes had requested an interview for their 30 Under 40 retrospective. But none of that mattered as much as what happened on Christmas Eve. I spent Christmas at my apartment in San Francisco. Not alone. Angela and David were there along with a few other team members who didn't have family obligations. We ordered Chinese food, watched movies, and didn't talk about work. But at 7 p.m. my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Unknown, Tegan, it's Dad. Your mother gave me this number. I'd like to talk. If you're willing. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I called him. Tegan. His voice was different. Smaller somehow than I'd ever heard it. Thank you for calling. What did you want to say, Dad? Silence on the line. I waited. I've been reading about you, he finally said. Not the news articles. Everyone's seen those. But I found some old interviews. Tech blogs from when you were just starting out. A profile in Stanford's alumni magazine from 2018. I remembered that interview. I talked about growing up watching my father build a company, about how logistics was in my blood even if no one recognized it. There was a quote, Dad continued. You said, my father taught me everything I know about supply chains. He just doesn't know he taught me. I remember. Why didn't you ever tell me? About the company. About what you were building. The question had haunted me for 12 years. Now finally I had to answer it. I tried, Dad. I showed you my business plan when I was 12. I told you about Velocity Systems when I started it. I invited you to my first office opening, my first major funding round, my first acquisition. You said you were busy. You said it wasn't your kind of thing. You said. I know what I said. His voice cracked. I know. So I stopped trying. I built everything myself without your support, without your approval, without your acknowledgement. And somewhere along the way I realized I didn't need any of those things. I never had. But you bought my company. I bought a struggling logistics firm with excellent infrastructure and terrible management. The fact that it was yours was. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Coincidental. Was it? I thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated. No, I finally admitted. It wasn't coincidental. I could have acquired any number of companies with Titan's profile. But I chose yours because I wanted you to see. Not to hurt you. Not for revenge. Just to be seen. I see you now. Do you? I see a woman who built something extraordinary. Who did it alone, without help, without encouragement, without anyone believing in her. He exhaled shakily. I see my daughter. And I'm ashamed that I didn't see her sooner. I let the words settle. What do you want from this call, Dad? I want the chance to know you. The real you. Not the version I invented in my head, but the person you actually became. He paused. I know I don't deserve it. I know I can't undo what I did. But I'd like to try. If you'll let me. I walked to my window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. The city where I'd built everything. The city my family had never visited. I'm not ready to forgive, I said. 32 years of being invisible isn't erased by one phone call. I understand. But I'm not closed to the idea of something. Eventually. If you're willing to put in the work. What kind of work? The kind where you listen instead of lecture. Where you ask questions instead of giving answers. Where you treat me like a colleague instead of a disappointment. I paused. The kind where you actually get to know me, not the idea of me you've been carrying around all these years. Silence. Then, I can do that. I want to do that. Then we'll see. I ended the call and stood at the window for a long time, watching the lights of the city sparkle against the December darkness. Behind me, my team was laughing at something on television. Ahead of me was a new year, a new chapter, a company to run and an empire to build. The little girl with the tiny internet thing had grown up. She'd built something extraordinary, something that couldn't be dismissed or diminished or ignored. And finally, impossibly, her family was starting to see it. Not because they wanted to. Because they had no other choice. And somehow that was enough. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just the quiet satisfaction of being exactly who I'd always been. Visible at last, undeniable, entirely on my own terms. The Thanksgiving takeover, they'd called it. I preferred to think of it as the moment I finally came home.